Charleston celebrates its 350th anniversary this year, and to commemorate that, Charleston Pirate Tours brings you Charleston History Highlights. Hi, Eric with Charleston Pirate Tours. Today I'm at Breach Inlet down here on Sullivan's Island, and want to talk a little bit about pirates. Well, I mean, it's what we do every day, and decided I would even dress up in my pirate clothes and bring out old Bob here. He needed a little outdoor time. Let's talk a little bit about why piracy was so important to the early days of this colony. And reason being, folks, this was a private colony. There's no help coming from England. And the only people that had any influence were the proprietors who were actually in England. So these pirates were welcomed here just like war heroes. And in many cases, they were welcomed in here as a savior, a financial savior. Governor John Archdale welcomed Henry Avery into town. And when he welcomed him into town, these pirates had their pockets stuffed with silver and gold, and they spent it wildly. In fact, Henry Avery was so appreciative of his hospitality, he gifted him a ship. 1686, Sir Henry Morgan. Everybody's heard of old Captain Morgan. Well, he had gone down and attacked Panama. And when they leave out, they head back toward Jamaica, but they find out they're not welcome in Jamaica. So where did they come? You guessed it, right here to Charlestown. Governor Morton welcomed them in here like heroes, because they too had their pockets stuffed with plenty of money. Now, pirates also had a huge influence in how we did become successful. Let's talk about rice for a minute. Remember that? Our biggest cash crop? Well, in 1685, a pirate captain gave Henry Woodward some rice seed from Madagascar. 1693, Thomas Smith received rice seed from Madagascar. And we all know what rice did for the economy here. But I want to talk about one particular ship today, and that was the ship known as the Loyal Jamaica. Now, that was actually the third name that this ship had. Its first name was the HMS Portsmouth. But unfortunately, after it set sail in 1665, it was later captured by Dutch privateers and then captured again by a pirate by the name of Edward Davis, or Davies. I've seen it spelled both ways. That's when the ship took on a new name, Bachelor's Delight. Now, this ship sailed around the Pacific as well as in the Caribbean, but ended up here in 1691. Now, this is where the story gets interesting. One of the members of the crew was a guy named George Rayner. Now, Rayner was in town, probably hanging out in a tavern with local businessmen, and met up with these guys, and they decided to help purchase this pirate ship. Now, and the resources I've got, they are referred to as a pirate syndicate, the men that bought this ship. Now, one of the members of this, quote, syndicate happened to be our governor at that time, Seth Sothel. Now, a little backstory on him. At that time, Carolina was so large that it actually had two governors. You had one in the northern Carolina area and the southern Carolina area. Of course, the southern part would have been Charlestown. North, Sothel was actually the governor up around the Albemarle Sound area, but this guy was a scoundrel. He was a thief. He was a cattle thief. He locked people up that would oppose him. And so eventually, he was run out of the north area, and where did he end up? Right here in Charlestown. And guess what? He became the governor here. So now, this guy did lots of business with pirates. So in the process of this meeting, he made sure they were secured a letter of marque. Now, letters of marque are given to ships, and once they receive it, that ship is then called a privateer. Now, folks, I'm going to tell you, there is a very thin gray line between a pirate and a privateer. Mainly privateers were used during wartime, but there's really not much of a war going on at that time, so it was basically given to them for cover, if you will. So they sail out of here, and they head out to get whatever they could get. Now, we know they made it as far as the Red Sea. In fact, Red Sea piracy was a big thing back in those days, and we welcomed many pirates in here who had made trips to the Red Sea. Why? It was very lucrative, because they would attack the Moors, who would always have lots of silver and gold on their ships. So now, we know they were there because they came back through St. Mary's Island. Now, St. Mary's Island is just off the coast of Madagascar. It was the main port where these pirates would show up. Now, there was a guy by the name of Adam Baldrick, who was a former pirate himself, who was the manager of a little outpost, and he kept copious notes of those pirates that would come into port there. And he spoke of the Bachelor's Delight as it would come in there, and talked about George Rayner and the men having plenty of money and were well off. And when they leave out, they said they're now returning back to Carolina. So now they come back to South Carolina, arriving here in April of 1692. But there's a problem. Now, what is the problem? Well, they had sailed out of here with the blessings of Governor Sothel. Well, guess what? He's not the governor anymore. He's now been removed and replaced by another governor by the name of Philip Ludwell. Now, they didn't know how they would be welcomed back here. Would they be considered pirates, or would they be considered good, loyal privateers to the governor of South Carolina, who unfortunately was no longer the governor? So they anchored their ship out in a stretch of harbor and waited for word that they could come to town. At that point, they decided to give the ship a new name, the Loyal Jamaica, hoping maybe that would kind of ease the sting of them sailing out of here as Bachelor's Delight. Well, they weren't welcomed into town. So what ended up happening, they sailed a little further north up to an area that we call Awendaw, or basically where the Seaweed Bay is located. And that's where they went ahead and abandoned the ship. Now, it's interesting to note, they went up there to do that. And I'll get to why I think that's an interesting point in a moment. Well, now, the only way these men were going to be welcomed into town, at this point, 22 men had decided to settle here in Charlestown. They had to be sponsored. So, 2 of the men were sponsored by a man whose name was Nathaniel Johnson, Sir Nathaniel Johnson. He sponsored 2 of the members of that crew to be able to come into town. One, a man named Robert Fenwick, the first Fenwick we have a record of in South Carolina. And of course, his brother John was the one who built Fenwick Hall. Now, according to their website, the name is actually pronounced Finnick. Your choice, however you want to pronounce it. The other person he sponsored, Thomas Pinckney, the very first Pinckney in South Carolina history. And we all know the history of the Pinckney family. Charles Pinckney, Charles Coatsworth Pinckney. So yeah, these were prominent names. Now, there was one other name on the ship. His name was Daniel O'Ree. Now, this is another reason why we believe the ship was actually here before 1692, because at that point, there were already members of the O'Ree family living here in this area. So I believe that Daniel O'Ree probably met these guys in that tavern and probably decided to sail with them, maybe for adventure, but probably more for profit. These men now come ashore, and they're welcome because many of them had lots of money. Each member of this crew, their cut was 1,100 English pounds sterling. Now, you don't think that's a lot of money? I did a little math with a website that I found about pounds, US dollars, going back in history. Basically, 1,100 English pounds sterling in 1692 today would be the equivalent of somewhere between 2.3 and 2.4 million US dollars in 2020. So they had quite a bit of money when they came ashore. Now, the 4 names that I like to bring up whenever I talk about this ship on a tour, of course, we've talked about those already. We talked about Thomas Pinckney. We talked about Daniel O'Ree. Interesting to note, his great-nephew, Colonel Peter O'Ree, who was a hero in the American Revolution, well, that's who they named O'Ree County after, where Myrtle Beach is located. And then, of course, we have Robert Fenwick, or Fenwick. But the other one I wanted to mention was George Rayner, the captain. He chose Charlestown as his home. By 1699, this man owned Kiowa Island. Now, George Rayner finally decided that Kiowa Island was just too big for one person, so he ended up dividing up the island among some of his family. But folks, the bottom line is this: piracy played a huge role in Charleston's survival and its history. I'm Eric with Charleston Pirate Tours. Happy birthday, Charleston.